talking about economic and social mobility today and have two of the premier experts on stage with me here today. And so we're going to dive straight in with Raj's work. Raj has been working on issues of intergenerational mobility, especially. I think, guess for decades now. We're going to have to start measuring it in decades, Raj, right? And so I'm going to ask you to summarize all of that work just in like 1 minute for this audience. Give us the TikTok version of Raj Chetty's findings on what are the main barriers to upward mobility, who's upwardly mobile, what are the challenges we face in this area?
Great. Well, great to be here with you, Richard and Camille, and with all of you today. So I've been studying economic opportunity for the past decade using large-scale big data from tax records, from Facebook, from various other sources. And I would say at a very high level, to give you the TikTok version, but I'm not sure I can, but we're at a point in this country where I think lots of us came to this country, or our parents came to this country in search of a better life for our children, the idea that America is a country where anyone through hard work can rise up in the income distribution, achieve a better life. And what we've seen in the data very clearly is, unfortunately, that's no longer the case for many Americans. Only 50% of kids in the current generation, we estimate, will go on to out-earn their parents to have a better standard of living. And so the American dream is, in some sense, slipping out of grasp. And so what we've been doing is trying to understand why that's the case. And I know we're going to talk about that in more depth in this conversation, but let me make two main points. One is that 50% statistic masks a lot of variation across different parts of the country, across different subgroups. There's some people for whom opportunity is still well within grasp. For instance, if you're growing up as a poor kid in Dubuque, Iowa, in the rural Midwest, you still have great chances of rising up. But in many other parts of the country, for instance, in Charlotte, North Carolina, for example, kids born to families and low-income families, kids born to low-income parents have very poor chances of rising up. So the landscape of opportunity is very varied across the United States. And the second point I want to make is that landscape is actually changing quite rapidly over time. So the answers to these questions are changing quite rapidly. We were actually going to release a new study today called Changing Opportunity on exactly that new data. Other news intervened, so that'll be coming out.
It's a great day to do it. It's slow
a little
news
bit later, but you will see that in the coming days, and I think that's an important aspect.
And can you just, any preview of that? I mean, I don't want you to scoop yourself, but
Yeah.
is there anything that you're learning from that would add to the knowledge you've got?
So at a very broad level, what I'd say is the contours of economic opportunity by race and class, two key determinants of opportunity in America, traditionally tremendously lower rates of upward mobility for Black Americans than white Americans, big divides if you're born to high-income parents versus low-income parents. These are changing quite rapidly, as you'll see when we put out these new data. And the factors driving that change, Richard, are related to factors that we and others have focused on in recent years, things like social capital, the nature of communities, and so on.
Great. Camille, you've been working on this for I don't know, almost as long as Raj, but in different ways, and particularly looking at it through the issues of kind of race, place, gender, et cetera. Is there anything that you would want to try and extract from Raj or move the conversation on to?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, obviously we talk a lot about upward mobility, and I think it's really interesting, Raj, you've done some work in the past that has also shown that some people are downwardly mobile. So I wanted you to chat a little bit about, who is more vulnerable to being downwardly mobile? What do those profiles look like?
So thanks for bringing that up, Camille. So, usually we focus on upward mobility. A lot of us are interested in this room on how we can help more people rise up. But I think, as you note, it's equally important in some cases to focus on who starts out in a high-income family and might not have a chance of remaining in the middle class or remaining at the top of the distribution. And one group in particular stands out as being very, unfortunately, downwardly mobile, and that's Black men in the United States. So a Black boy born to families even at the top of the income distribution has almost the same chance of ending up at the bottom of the income distribution as he does of remaining near the top of the income distribution. That stands in stark contrast with the patterns that you see for white men, where if you're born to a high-income family, odds are you're going to remain in the upper middle class in your own generation. Now, to me, that when we started to do this work on race and economic opportunity that I've mentioned a couple of times, that was really shocking. I had expected, as I suspect many here would, that there would be differences in economic mobility by race, given the long history of racial disparities in America. But I had thought that if you had a sufficient amount of money, maybe race would start to become less important. And that turns out to be absolutely wrong. Even if you're from the highest income families, there are enormous differences in rates of downward mobility between black and white men. Now notice, I emphasize men here. Turns out if you look at black and white women, you see very similar rates of economic mobility. And so understanding the particular challenges that black men are facing, why they're on this sort of treadmill across generations where even after you come up in one generation, it's not sticking, I think that's fundamental to addressing racial disparities in America.
So I think we'll come on to social capital in a moment, because I know Camille's done a lot of work on that, including in Charlotte, as you've already mentioned. But just on this race, gender intersection, it's also true from your previous work, and I want to know if it's still true, that all of the black-white difference in upward mobility measured at a household level is explained by the differences in upward mobility between black and white men in terms of their individual incomes. And that's a very wonky but very important point that I think is quite often lost here, because what that means is that it's not that black women don't end up suffering the consequences of the lack of upward mobility of black men. But is that, A, have I got that right, and B, is that still true?
Yes, so that's absolutely right. So just to underscore what Richard's saying, if you're thinking about the source of racial disparities, you heard in the conversation with Governor Moore about racial wealth disparities and so on, what is fundamentally driving that? It's about differences in income, how that's happening across generations, and what we see very clearly is that it's coming from differences among men in particular. And to be clear, that's not to say black women are equally well off in some broad sense as white women, because they're growing up in households with lower levels of income, they're living in households with lower levels of total resources, but the source of the issue, if you were to pinpoint it, it would be the challenges that black men are facing, and that continues to be true. In fact, I think it might be even more accentuated as we go forward.
Interesting.
Oh, that is interesting, yeah. So Camille, you've led work on black boys and men at Brookings, and it's obviously it's an area that we've worked on together, but you've also done a lot of work around social capital, which is related to this as well. Can you just say a little bit about how you think about social capital and how it relates to Raj's work?
Sure, I think there are different types of social capital. There's obviously, people you hang out with and friends and that sort of thing. One of the things that we've been studying is who do you turn to when you're looking for a job, looking for housing opportunities or educational opportunities. And when you look broadly at that question across different kinds of demographic profiles, you find that, of course, white men are very, very well networked and have broad networks. And black men tend to have, on average, really, really tiny networks relative to social economic mobility. And that, again, I think feeds into this, just more larger question about what it is that we can do to alter that larger picture.
Yeah, so your work has dived into the specific networks where you've actually tracked. I thoroughly recommend the work because it gets into who people are connected with and who's less connected. But that also reinforces work that you've done, Raj, out of your shop, which uses a different approach, which uses anonymized Facebook meta data, but I think comes to similar conclusions, but it also comes to some very interesting conclusions about which institutions are kind of helping. Can you say a bit about your findings on social capital?
Yeah, absolutely. So the way we came to think about social capital, you've all probably heard the term. For many, many decades, social scientists and people in the public policy sphere have thought that who you're connected to, who you hang out with, as Camille put it, might be very important in determining outcomes from health to economic opportunities and so on. But it's been very difficult to measure social capital precisely and understand exactly how you might change it. So in a way that in the context of education, we have very clear measures of how much we're spending on education, for example. How exactly do we measure social capital? So our thought was, in the age of big data, in the age of social networks, social network data gives us clear information on who's connected to whom. So we set up a collaboration with Mark Zuckerberg and Meta and the Facebook core data science team to use Facebook's internal data in an anonymized form to study precisely that question and construct very granular measures of social capital across the United States. So you can actually look up on the web, if you go to a website, socialcapital.org, zip code by zip code in America, various measures of social capital. As Camille was noting, there are many different ways people have thought about measuring social capital, from how cohesive communities are, to how much people trust each other, how many friends they have. We ended up finding that one particular measure is extremely important. It turns out to be the single strongest predictor of economic mobility, and it's what we call economic connectedness, the extent to which low-income people are friends with high-income people. So just a very simple notion, if I showed you a map of the extent to which low-income people are friends with high-income people across America, it would look virtually identical to a map of rates of upward social mobility. Those two things are incredibly tightly related.
Right. Cross-class, though, that was the important point.
Cross-class is
Has
the
to
key.
be cross.
Cross-class interaction seems to be really the key. Being connected to someone who can bring you better opportunities, maybe job referrals, but also, I think quite importantly, potentially shape your aspirations. Or, if you've never met anyone who went to college, maybe you never think about going to college or applying to college yourself. If you're connected to people who've experienced that type of pathway, it may change your own choices.
Right. So actually, I'd love, Camille, we'll talk a bit, I'd love you to dig in about the Charlotte lessons maybe too, but just to push on this a little bit more, just to invite you to say a bit more. You said that connectedness, cross-class connectedness is the biggest predictor of upward mobility, bigger than other factors. That's an incredible finding, I think, to many people. So compared to what? Give us a sense of the other things that you probably more naturally think are the barriers that outperformed, if you like.
Yeah,
What are we comparing
absolutely. So before we did this work on social capital, we had a list of strongest predictors of economic mobility. Things like poverty rates, growing up in a community with concentrated poverty as opposed to a mixed income area was strongly negatively associated with your chances of rising up. The fraction of two-parent families in an area, the quality of schools, levels of inequality. Social capital, this new economic connectedness measure, not only, Richard, outperforms those measures in predicting economic mobility, it actually explains a number of those associations with economic mobility, which I find most striking. So let me clarify what I mean by that. Why is it that growing up in a more mixed income community is associated with higher rates of upward mobility? It turns out, from a statistical point of view, that that's because in a more mixed income area, you are more likely to have friends from the higher part of the income distribution. And once you account for that, there's actually no relationship between rates of poverty and rates of economic mobility. So it's not only the strongest predictor, it actually explains a number of other patterns that people have found.
It's really interesting. Camille, do you want to say a bit more about the work you did in Charlotte or actually anything? Because I think you, in some ways, you went deeper than your very powerful measure and found these big differences by race, you've already mentioned, by class, by gender. And what did we learn in terms of what we should do about it?
Sure. So in Charlotte and also 3 other cities, we've seen Wisconsin, Washington, D.C., and San Francisco, we actually did qualitative research. So we went out and asked 100 people in each of those cities who were representative of the population, who did they turn to when they were looking for a job or any housing or educational opportunity, and then we asked them to describe those people. And we created this very, very large database of what those networks look like, whether the people were similar in income, similar in education, similar in background, similar in race, et cetera. And what we discovered from that is that, particularly in Charlotte, but this was true throughout the research, is that these social networks tended to be highly racialized. Really, that means like very, very homogenous racially. And so resources, the kind of resources that are important to economic mobility actually flowed within those racial groups as opposed to between those racial groups. So, Raj and I have had an opportunity to work a lot in Charlotte. Charlotte has spent a lot of time thinking about social capital, and there are obviously some racial dimensions to thinking about social capital in Charlotte. But I'd be interested, Raj, in finding out what do we learn from all the work that Charlotte has been doing on social capital and social connectedness?
Yeah. So, Camille, so first, why the focus on Charlotte, for me at least? So when we put out our first study on how economic opportunity varies across areas, this was back in 2014, we measured children's chances of rising up in every city and every county in America. And it turns out of the 50 largest cities in America, Charlotte ranks last, 50th out of 50, in terms of your chances of rising up. Now that's in and of itself an interesting fact. I think what is particularly striking about it is, as many of you might know, Charlotte is typically viewed as the engine of jobs in the Southeast. By most conventional measures, you would think of Charlotte as a very prosperous city where there are many more high-paying jobs now than there were 20 years ago. People seem to be doing better. People are excited about progress in the city. So how can it be that Charlotte is 50th out of 50 in this ranking in terms of economic mobility for the kids who grow up in Charlotte and low-income families? So the way I think about it is that Charlotte basically imports talent. Lots of people move to Charlotte to get high-paying jobs at firms like Bank of America, which is headquartered in Charlotte. But apparently, and this is what we see in the new data where we can follow people over time, the kids who are growing up in low-income families in Charlotte itself are not necessarily benefiting from that prosperity. So motivated by that fact, when we just put that simple fact out there, I thought there was a very positive and constructive reaction in the Charlotte community. It was widely discussed in the local media, by public officials, by people in the private sector, CEO of Bank of America, and so on. They basically said, you know, we think our city's doing really well. How can we actually bring opportunity to local residents as opposed to just importing talent? And a key part of that was social capital. Let me give you just a very, some of this can be abstract, like what exactly do we mean by creating social capital, creating connections? Let me give you one example I like. They did many, many different things, investing hundreds of millions of dollars with nonprofits, changing local public policies on affordable housing and so on. Here's one example that I think captures the spirit of what we're talking about today. So Bank of America, again, I mentioned headquartered in Charlotte, they made a commitment to hire 1,000 people who grew up in low-income families in Charlotte itself. And they teamed up with a job training provider that many of you will know called Year Up, in combination with a local community college, to equip people with the skills needed to get those 1,000 jobs that they were advertising. And so it's very much in the spirit of create that network, try to target the efforts at a community where opportunity is lacking, implement a program that's not just providing technical skills, but also providing this wraparound social support to help people get these jobs. And I think initiatives like this, ultimately, obviously by itself is not gonna change the whole picture, but can add up to really changing things.
One of the things I worry about, and I'm gonna invite both of you to respond to this provocation, and I think it's relevant to your work, Camille, in Charlotte, is that when people talk about relationships, social capital, who you know, et cetera, that can sometimes be interpreted as saying that institutions don't matter. So rather than worrying about our schools or the justice system or family even, or churches, or we should just focus on programs that connect people, right? Let's just get everyone to mentor somebody. Let's just all make more friends, right? And so it gets interpreted as like, oh, all those institutions that policymakers worry about, colleges, it's not about that. It's just about who you know. I don't think that's right, but that is a potential critique. And I know that you came out of your work, Camille, I think more convinced of the role of institutions than less so.
Absolutely.
Can you say a bit more about that?
Yeah,
And then Raj would like
absolutely.
you to
So
comment too.
when we did the study that I mentioned, one of the things we tried to find out is how did people actually create friendships and the kinds of relationships that are important to social mobility. Yeah. Well, it turns out a lot of those start at school during adolescence. This should be no surprise. That continues on if you go to college, and then obviously the workplace, right? So these are all institutions. So if at some point your ability to form those relationships is disrupted by, high levels of disciplinary action in a school when you're an adolescent, for instance, it happens a lot to black boys and other boys of color, then you are a little bit behind in your ability to form those kinds of relationships. And so the schools are a place where that's kind of mediated. Again, colleges are, and again, workplaces are. And then I would also say neighborhoods are as well. And a lot of the work that you've done on neighborhoods, I think, speaks to that. But clearly, if you're in a very, very segregated neighborhood where you don't have access to other people, that also makes it very difficult. Right. And I think this is something I'd like to press you on a little bit. Yeah. Like you have talked about friend bias and this sort of thing, but it also makes it very difficult to have those kinds of relationships that are important to economic mobility.
Yeah, those connections don't just happen out of thin air, do they? They tend to take place within institutional settings.
Exactly.
And so if those institutional settings are weaker, and or certain people are excluded from those institutional settings at higher rates, then that's going to have an effect on social capital. So it's interesting in light of what you said about it, maybe what explains what. It goes both ways, right?
Yes.
That's what you found too. And you found some interesting differences between different institutions as well.
Yes. So let me elaborate a bit on the issues Camille was raising. So first, a simple point I would make is I think intensity really matters here. So you mentioned mentoring programs, Richard, and there could be some mentoring programs that would have a big effect, but just sort of the notion that you're going to make more friends, connect people, spend a couple hours with someone, and create more of a connected network. My sense is that's not going to fundamentally change the picture. We always find in our work very strong dosage effects, meaning the more intense the connection, the more intense the changes in the environment, the more years to which you're exposed to these different environments, the bigger the effect. So it's not something where you just create a connection, totally changes things. It's about being immersed in a different environment where you're exposed to different people while you're growing up. So how do you get there? That's where I think institutions are really important. As you said, people are not just randomly making friends. It's a function of the situation that we're in. And in my mind, I think of it as involving two key determinants. The first, which Camille touched upon, is who you're exposed to. If you live in a very segregated environment, all the low-income kids go to one school, all the kids from high-income families go to another school, obviously you can't have a very connected society. You can only be friends with the people you meet. But then second, even conditional on integration, you all in the public discourse have spent a lot of time trying to think about how you tackle that problem of segregation, changing zoning, changing school district boundaries, affordable housing, and so on. But even conditional on that, you have a second issue that you mentioned, friending bias. That's a term we introduced in our work on these issues. And the idea there is we find that even when people are attending the same school, a black kid and a white kid, or a kid from a low-income family and a high-income family are much less likely to interact with each other. And it turns out that if you use the Facebook data and try to measure how much of the social disconnection by class in America is due to a lack of exposure versus a lack of friending bias, it's about 50-50. That is to say, even if we manage to perfectly integrate every college, every school, every neighborhood, which would obviously be incredibly difficult to do, you would still have half of the social disconnection left. So last point on this, coming back to your question about which institutions seem to matter here.
Yeah. Also, by the way, it's another bias for everyone to worry about. If you didn't have enough biases to worry about, you've now got to worry about your friending bias. You're all going through your friend networks now thinking, am I biased? And who I'm friends with? And
but on that, actually, my sense is it's not necessarily an individual bias. It's something to do with institutions. And so to give you a data point that speaks to that, suppose you take a given person and look at the friends they make, say, in their religious institution, their church or their synagogue, versus the friends they make in their workplace or in their neighborhood. Turns out the friendships that same person makes in a religious institution or in a recreational group tend to be much more uniform across class lines. You tend to be equally likely to befriend a high-income person who's a part of your church versus a low-income person, whereas in your neighborhood, in other settings, in your school, in your college, there's much more stratification by class. And so, Richard, what that tells us, I think, is it's not actually an inherent bias, I think, necessarily in someone's head. It's the way you interact with people. Do you find something in common? How does society get organized? Showing that this is all ultimately malleable, perhaps, by changing our institutions.
There's a structure within the institutions that is facilitating or hindering that kind of cross-class, that connectedness, which you hope religious institutions won't have, right? Most religious institutions will have a claim about equality, right? But it does look as if on this front anyway, they're living up to that claim, that when you're in the synagogue, you're in the church, that you're as likely to become friends with someone of a different class to you as of the same class as you.
That's right. And I think, it's not just about religious institutions in different types of places, but it's also things that are in our policy control. So to give you another, maybe more tangible example of something we can change, we also find much less of this friending bias in smaller groups as opposed to bigger groups. So in big schools, there's a lot of separation. In small schools, people tend to make friendships and connections across boundaries. I think that's quite intuitive. If you think about how you yourself might behave in a big group like this one versus in a smaller group where you might interact with everybody, even people you're unfamiliar with. And so there's a lesson there potentially in terms of how we structure things.
Do you agree with that finding, Camille?
I do. I do think, as you said, intensity. When you're in smaller groups, you don't have the opportunity to go off in your separate directions. So I think that's also important. And obviously the kinds of institutions that tend to favor where the point of departure is, we're all human and we're all equal and that sort of thing, I think tend to be better places to create the kind of cross-class and potentially racially diverse networks as well. I have a question for you, though, which is around, obviously the Facebook data really focused on class, and I know you didn't have access to the race data. Do you have any thoughts about how race and class interact when we're thinking about friending bias and we're thinking about creating those larger networks?
Yeah, so in that Facebook study, we weren't able to look at race directly, but other evidence suggests that stratification by race, as you might expect intuitively, is even greater than stratification by class. And I think it's that dynamic that reinforces some of the issues we were talking about early in the conversation. Why is it that Black kids and Black men in particular face such challenges in rising up? If you tend to be friends with people of your own racial and ethnic background and who you're connected to really matters, the fact that we have this big divide between Black and white Americans in terms of current economic status and opportunities means that that's likely to propagate across generations. To put it in simple terms, white kids in low-income families, there's a greater chance they're connected to somebody who is in a career that could lead to a good pathway for them, who has gone to college, who has gotten a good job. Black kids are less likely to be in that position, and they're interacting more with people in their own communities who have fewer of those opportunities, and that perpetuates the racial divide.
One of the things I really like about this from both of your work is that it completely vaults over what is very often a partisan divide in this area. Because you might see more conservative people will say it's about relationships, it's about church, it's about family, it's about connectedness within, it's about community, and maybe more people on the progressive side will be it's about school funding, it's about zoning, it's about affordable housing, it's about public spaces. And actually what this research is telling us is you need the latter to get the former, right? It doesn't, so the conservatives are right, and your own work shows this, is that families really matter, churches really matter, relationships really matter, but it also, both of your work also shows that doesn't happen magically, and it happens within neighborhoods that are massively segregated, schools that are massively segregated, housing markets that are rigged in favor of the rich and against the poor, et cetera. And so there's an ideal world here where we could actually get an opportunity agenda that's giving the truth to both. Is that a fair summary of your work and your work?
I think it is, and I think I'm interested, Raj, in understanding, you do a lot of work that looks at specific places, right? Understanding where are we seeing progress, and where are people doing well, and what are the attributes of those places?
What gives us hope?
Yeah.
And then you can answer the same question that you just asked, Raj.
Yes, I mean, if you look across the US, at least historically, I mentioned earlier, places like the rural Midwest, right? You see kids have great chances of rising up. You may not have thought of the rural Midwest as the economic powerhouse of the US. What is going on there? I give that example because I think it captures some of the factors we've touched upon. So say you're growing up in a small town. My wife grew up in a small town in southern Illinois. Her dad was the town doctor. If you think about who she interacted with, her friends in high school, they were from a very diverse group of, diverse set of backgrounds in her town because there was no option to kind of segregate. Even if you were from a more affluent family, everyone went to the same school. If you thought about the nature of social connections, the quality of the schools in the Midwest, there's a lot of investment traditionally in places like Iowa and so on. All of these factors point in the direction
and they clustered together.
That cluster and lead to higher levels of economic mobility. I'm not saying every place can be like that, but there are lessons there to be taken to other places. And to echo what you said, Richard, which I absolutely agree with, I think, first of all, I think the issue of opportunity is one that bridges the political divide. People may have different views about inequality. I found, naturally, if some people make a lot more money than others, some people think it's fair for them to keep those rewards. Other people think we should have more redistributive policies. You can reasonably have different views on those issues. I think everyone pretty much ascribes to the view that in America we aspire to be a place where no matter your background, you should have a shot of making it. And so I think that brings people together. And then I think what I've found from the research is that the findings themselves turn out to actually bridge the divide, as you said.
Right,
because I think
it's almost like one side doesn't have all the truth.
Yes,
Right.
and I mean, I think that also means we need to come together in thinking about the solutions.
Yeah.
It's not just about the dollars that we invest in affordable housing or in education or job training. It's about how you connect those then to the factors like social
To
connection and
institutions, yeah.
so
Okay,
forth
thank you.
to have an
And
impact.
Camille, what gives you hope, or what's the one hopeful thought that you'd want to kind of leave the audience with in terms of where there's some traction here?
Well, following on the Maryland themes, the Maryland governor was just here. I would say that Montgomery County, Maryland, which is just outside here of Washington, D.C., has some of the most diverse communities in the U.S., lots of immigrants as well as others, it's very much a place of opportunity, and I think your work
Yes.
shows that as well, for a variety of folks. And that's a place where there are lots of deep community organizations, where the institutions such as schools and the workplace, et cetera, really function well for a range of folks. And so I think to the extent that we can have the kinds of environments where those institutions are operating well, and where they attract really diverse people, and those diverse people are actually employed, are parts of very large community networks, I think we'd be in great shape.
I'll just close by saying that I think it's, as a JFF board member, I can say that a strong belief for us is that good policy at any level, church, school district, state, should, wherever possible, be informed by the best possible research. And on this stage with us, we have two of the very best researchers in this field. I encourage you to look at their work, and it's been a great privilege to have them on this stage.